The temperature inside the submarine had climbed past unbearable. Sweat dripped from metal walls. The air was thick with carbon dioxide, and every man on board believed war had already begun. Deep beneath the ocean, during the height of the Cold War, a Soviet vessel was being bombarded with explosive charges from above. The crew had lost contact with Moscow. To them, it looked like the start of World War III. Standard procedure was clear. If war had begun, they were authorized to launch a nuclear torpedo. One officer reached for the final confirmation, but another man aboard, Vasily Arkhipov, hesitated. Not because he had proof, not because he had orders, just because something didn't feel right. That single, instinctive pause inside a submarine of the Soviet Navy may have prevented a nuclear exchange with the United States and quietly saved countless lives before the world even realized how close it came. No one aboard knew they were part of a standoff that historians would later call one of the most dangerous moments ever recorded. Above them, U.S. naval forces were dropping what sounded like depth charges signals meant to force the submarine to surface, not destroy it, but sealed inside steel walls with failing air and rising panic. The distinction was impossible to hear. To the crew, it sounded like war. The captain was convinced conflict had already begun near Cuba, and without communication from Moscow, he assumed the worst. Their homeland might already be under attack. If that were true, launching the nuclear torpedo wouldn't be escalation. What no one inside the submarine realized was that the explosions weren't meant to kill them. The U.S. ships above had strict orders. Signal, not strike. The charges were deliberately weak naval warning devices, not weapons. On the surface, leaders like John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev were locked in tense negotiations, both desperate to avoid the very war the crew below believed had already started. But down in the suffocating heat, that crucial detail never reached them. All they could hear were explosions, and in a nuclear standoff, sound can be more powerful than truth. Inside the submarine, conditions were collapsing fast. The heat had climbed past 45 degrees Celsius. Batteries were failing, and oxygen levels were dropping with every breath. Men were fainting at their posts. Others argued in whispers that turned into shouts. Sweat blurred vision. Thoughts slowed. Time itself seemed to melt in the suffocating dark beneath the Atlantic Ocean. On the surface, commanders in Washington, D.C. believed they were carefully controlling a tense situation. Below, that careful control felt like a full-scale assault. The captain's voice cut through the chaos. Prepare the nuclear torpedo. In that moment, procedure, fear, exhaustion, and misunderstanding all aligned like tumblers in a lock about to turn. The final authorization didn't belong to one man. A nuclear launch aboard that submarine required agreement from 3 senior officers. 2 had already said yes. The captain was ready. The political officer agreed. All that remained was the quiet third voice. The one man who hadn't spoken yet. Somewhere far above them, fleets maneuvered across the Caribbean Sea, and strategists inside the Pentagon believed the situation was contained. Down below, history balanced on silence. If you pay close attention right here, you can almost feel the second stretching the precise instant when a single decision was about to separate catastrophe from coincidence. For decades, no one outside a tight circle even knew how close the world had come. The incident was buried in classified archives, scattered across reports, naval logs, and transcripts stamped secret on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It wasn't until years later when analysts and historians finally began cross-checking. Files in places like Havana and inside the White House, records that the pattern emerged. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the night, the explosions, the silence, the near launch. What they discovered wasn't just a forgotten Cold War episode. It was proof that the world had once stood seconds from nuclear war, and almost no one had realized it happened. When investigators finally aligned the testimonies, one detail stood out like a fingerprint at a crime scene. The launch hadn't been stopped by a system, a protocol, or a command from above. It had been stopped by disagreement. 2 officers had insisted the torpedo should be fired. One refused. According to reconstructed naval records later compared with declassified material from the U.S. Navy and Soviet archives, the argument inside that submarine wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was tense, procedural, almost quiet. a debate held in suffocating heat while the world unknowingly hovered on the brink. And in that claustrophobic chamber, the most powerful weapon on board remained unfired. Not because war wasn't possible, but because one man insisted they might be wrong. Years later, analysts tried to calculate the odds of that moment unfolding exactly as it did. The submarine just happened to be cut off from communication. The warning charges sounded just threatening enough. The temperature rose just high enough to cloud judgment. And the launch protocol just happened to require unanimous consent. Statistically, each factor alone was ordinary. Together, they formed a chain so unlikely that military historians, comparing files from NATO and documents tied to the Kremlin, described it as a near-impossible convergence, not fate, not luck. A razor-thin alignment of variables where, if even one detail shifted slightly, the outcome wouldn't have been a close call. It would have been history. Had that torpedo launched, the consequences wouldn't have stayed underwater. Military simulations conducted years later suggested the detonation would almost certainly have been interpreted as a deliberate nuclear strike. Retaliation protocols on both sides were designed for speed, not hesitation. Within minutes, command centers would be making irreversible decisions, and missiles could have been on their way toward cities like New York City and London before diplomats even understood what triggered it. What makes it chilling isn't just how close it came, it's how ordinary the trigger was. No master plan, no grand strategy, just a misread signal, a sealed submarine, and a decision that almost turned a local misunderstanding into a global catastrophe. In the end, the investigation reached a conclusion as precise as it was unsettling. Declassified naval records confirmed the explosions were harmless, signaling charges, never intended as an attack. Strategic communications showed no war had begun. Command logs proved that retaliation would have followed within minutes if a nuclear blast had been detected. The chain was complete, verified years later by historians comparing archives from the Soviet Union with diplomatic timelines preserved by the United Nations. The mystery wasn't whether disaster almost happened, it was how it didn't. Not because of technology, not because of policy, but because a single officer paused long enough to question what everyone else accepted as reality. That hesitation born from instinct, doubt, and timing no one could have planned became the quiet coincidence that stopped a nuclear launch. No headlines, no celebration, just silence where history almost ended.